สันตาปารชาคชาติกาเทเสตุธัมมังอนุกัมปิมังปัชชัง.
So that was the traditional invitation for a talk, and now I'll begin with a homage to the Triple Gem. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. People can continue to meditate. It's the same in our tradition as listening to a talk. Last week we began to speak about the Samaditi Sutta, right view, which is the 9th discourse in the middle length discourses, Majjhima Nikaya 9. And in it, Venerable Sariputta, one of the Buddha's foremost disciples, speaks about different ways one can have right view, harmonious view. And right view is one of the foundations of the holy life that Ajahn Chah would emphasize again and again, of the path. There's a wonderful sutta where a monk named Bahya asks how he should practice for the Buddha to give him the teaching in brief. And the Buddha said one should purify and develop the starting point of all skillful qualities. That is well-purified morality, well-purified virtue, and views made straight. Having done such, one should develop the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So views made straight, this framework we use to encounter and contextualize our experience of the world, and particularly of suffering. How do we look at the discontent and stress in our lives in such a way that it becomes not an unnecessary and yet inevitable obstacle to the dream we continually chase, but rather a tool towards humility and wisdom and purification? Ajahn Sucitto spoke about this recently, saying that any teaching that doesn't touch on the 4 Noble Truths is incomplete. And, at the end of the day, human existence is just, it's not that great. There's a lot of difficulties in it, this dream of a perfect marriage, perfect health until you die in your bed, simultaneously with your loved one at 80 years old, in your sleep. What a powerful dream. And we buy into it again and again, and it does us an enormous disservice because life is never like that. One etymological translation of dukkha, the word for stress or suffering, is a wheel slightly off center. And that's the world. It's just always a little off. There's always something a little wrong. And as long as we look to that dream and the world for something it can't provide, then there's always a sense of disappointment, of grasping, and a continual chase towards a horizon that we never reach. But if we have right view, if we begin life with an understanding of the Four Noble Truths, and instead of running from suffering and stress and the difficulty, look rather to comprehend it, to understand it, and thereby move through it and let it go, and transcend it to something deeper. When we stop looking to external conditions as a refuge and begin looking to internal ones, this is the foundational pivot point of a life. It's a moment of grace. It's the adoption of right view. It's that simple. So in the previous talk, we spoke about the first section of the sutta, where the Buddha speaks about the Venerable Sariputta speaks about the 10 paths of wholesome and unwholesome action. Unwholesome being stealing, killing, harsh speech, lying, greediness, ill will, wrong view, and all the other trespasses of virtue. And the wholesome roots being their opposite, living a life of well-purified virtue, not killing, not stealing, speaking truthfully, gently, not gossiping, not getting drunk on our aversion, our greed, our delusion, but walking straight with an eye towards nibbana, towards enlightenment. And the roots of these paths being greed, hatred, and delusion, or in the wholesome roots, non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. And in a sense, what the Buddha is talking about there is what we're feeding in our lives. We are either on one road or the other, the wholesome or the unwholesome, the skillful or the blameworthy. In every moment, no matter how mundane, are we giving up that sense of grasping and trying to move into the world with a sense of blessings and letting go? Or are we grasping and allowing ourselves to feed the qualities of greed, hatred, and delusion? Which road are we on? The second section of the sutta, which is today's topic, is what we're feeding on the paths. Not what we're feeding, but what we're taking our own nourishment from. There's a catechism in the suttas called the Novices Questions, which is sort of a standard list that the monastics would ask new novices who ordained. And it goes, what is the one? What is the two? What is the three? What is the four? And the twos and the threes and the fours are what you'd expect. Things like very standard and well-known lists, such as the Four Noble Truths for the fours, and so on. But the one is interesting, because what you'd think when they say, what is the one? You think that the answer would be, in light of the Vedic and Brahminical backdrop to India, it would be a oneness. But rather than steering towards that, the Buddha points in the answer to that specific question, he points to something very different. He says, the one is the fact, the single fact, that all beings feed. All beings take nourishment. And it's not that he's not pointing away from the fact that there is a transcendent aspect to a human mind or a human potential. But what he's doing is he's pointing to a very practical, applicable fact in everyday life of seeing that we all take nourishment and feed and crave off of something. And in a very real sense, the path could be thought of as a steady relinquishing of old, unwholesome roots of our nourishment to wholesome, greater, more refined qualities and sources of nourishment for the heart. The Buddha speaks about 3 kinds of happiness. The first is called amisa sukha, or sensual happiness. And it's the happiness we gain from pleasant sights, sounds, relationship experience. And there's a place for these, but if it's our only source of happiness, it's problematic because those things fade and they're fragile. We can't control the external world. And if we constantly depend on that condition being a certain way, then as the marriage changes, or the body breaks, or we sicken, or the rival political party gains power, or someone takes the really good donut you were looking at, whatever it is, something will disappoint you. Inevitably, there is a betrayal there. I remember going to the hospital in Thailand, and things are really out in the open there. You have hospital corridors with bed after bed after bed. And my biggest impression was this sense of people there being betrayed by the body. Of living with this strange delusion that the body will always be healthy, and then suddenly it's not. And if there's not been any perspective cultivated, if there's been no interior source of happiness brought to bear, if we haven't become skilled at finding an internal happiness, then our hearts are inevitably bound to those external conditions, such as the body. And when it breaks, our hearts break too. So this is where the Buddha points to the second source of happiness, or the second type of happiness, which is niramisa sukha, spiritual happiness. And these are the internal qualities and sources of happiness we cultivate on the path. It's the glow and warmth of metta internally. It's the pleasure and rapture of samadhi, the well-concentrated mind. It's the sense of purity of heart and singleness of purpose that comes with orienting oneself on the spiritual path. It's the sense of blamelessness that comes with a virtuous life. And those sources of happiness are not only more subtle and refined, but they're less fragile. The body can go, the marriage can fade. But if you've cultivated the heart by meditating, if you've learned to be skilled at using the breath to bring up pleasure in the body, if you've expanded the mind's capacity to develop loving kindness, then even when those things happen, you have another source of nourishment. The heart does not break. And this lets us go about the world and relationship and all the experience that we have to deal with a light touch and a loving touch, because we can let things around us, relationships, be what they will be without trying to constantly control our loved one, without constantly having to control with a white-knuckled grip our career, our children, our parents, everything. Our dogs. I live with 2 chihuahuas or nearby them. The 4 nourishments, the 4 roots the Buddha said we take nourishment from are food, physical and refined, and that's the nourishment of the body. Contact, being the contact of the sense bases, so seeing, smelling, hearing, tasting, touching, and internal images, fantasies, impressions, the 6 sense bases and their contact. The third is intention itself. And the fourth is consciousness. So these are a little difficult to go into. It gets a little academic at times. It's easy to understand, though, how they're all woven together in this experience of nourishing ourselves. When we eat a meal, for example, we're taking physical food. There's the taste of the physical food, that's contact. There's consciousness of the taste, that's consciousness. And those two are very similar, they're intertwined. It's not necessary in this case to distinguish them too carefully. And then there's intention, and that's an interesting one. In the case of food, it might be the intention to dive into it, to get lost in the flavors. The sense of thinking about the next bite before it's even happened. And often that's how we spend our lives and our whole meal. We're already thinking about the next thing. That's the mind moving out through intention and feeding off of that, actually, even as we eat. So in the experience of eating, all four nutriments are present. We're feeding off of all of them. But what happens is when we shut our eyes in meditation, we suddenly cut off two, well, assuming you're not eating while you're meditating, so we can just put that one down for a second. Usually we feed off of contact and consciousness mixed together. We're drawing from the world. We're looking for good sights, sounds, the next movie, the pleasant experience. Perhaps people are already thinking about what they'll have for the meal after this sit. And suddenly we close our eyes, and that's all gone. And the mind is starving. So what it does is it replaces all that lost nourishment that it used to be getting through consuming with the one remaining, or the main remaining nutriment that it has access to, which is intention. And this is when you sit and you close your eyes, and suddenly you find yourself thinking and planning and fantasizing about the movie you saw or you're going to see, or planning what you're going to make for dinner, or the work project, or what you should have said yesterday when he said that and how dare he. And all of this spinning of narrative, it's the mind trying to replace that lost nourishment with the drive of intention, these formations. The word is sanchetana, is intention, but it feeds right into the word sankhara, which is a Pali term for formation, and it can refer to everything from the fantasy that comes up in our mind to a strong and salient emotion. But in this case, it can be thought of as that, the fantasies that they churn out. And we can't fault the mind for that. So often it's coming to meditation, and most people we're addicted to the sensual realm around us, the external world. We've never cultivated an internal happiness. They did an experiment where they locked volunteers in a room for 20 minutes and told them they couldn't go to sleep, which says something about us right there, that they had to give them instructions to not sleep. And they put one thing in the room with them, which is a machine that delivers extremely unpleasant shocks electrically. And within about 10 minutes, most of the volunteers started shocking themselves just to have something to do. So this is what happens when we have no other source of happiness, is you lock someone in a room and they go crazy. And they'll take any contact rather than whatever blankness they assume is left if they don't distract themselves. It's a funny story, but that is the story of many of our lives. I remember hitting college and finding that I wouldn't stop, I couldn't. I tell that story of driving down the California coast, listening to Top 40 radio the whole time, reading the new Hunger Games, stopping at every, fast food joint I could, and just running from something. And only when I stepped into the monastery and its silence did I realize that I was just frantically running from something that I was not willing to stop and face. So when we enter meditation, it's not that we're giving up intention, but we're refining intention. And this is one of the big problems of how meditation is taught, is the instruction really is, so often, bring up one word and just keep coming back to it, or just place your attention at the breath and follow it and let it be natural. But these are such subtle sources of contact, of nourishment, compared to the movies, the career, the juicy argument you just had, the thing you can't stop thinking about, that in some sense they don't stand a chance. The mind will continually wander because there's much juicier food, even if it's unhealthy, right around the corner. But if you look at the Anapanasati Sutta, mindfulness of breathing, you notice that the verb in the first few steps of noticing the breath is just to know it, to pajanati is the Pali. But then for the subsequent 14 steps of that sutta, every single step uses the term sikati, which means to train, to apply intention in ever more subtle ways. So in meditation, we're channeling that intention towards a few things. But we have to work with that nutriment because that's our main one when we meditate. So there's a few ways we have to do this. First, we have to use insight to see what we're feeding on. What is the fantasy that keeps coming up, and what's the underlying intention behind it? Is it the intention, and this is where the hindrances come in, is it the intention to get lost in sensual desire? Is it the intention to get lost in anger? Is it the intention to get lost in sloth and drowsiness? Is it the intention to get lost in restlessness or in doubt? And just naming it and seeing what we're feeding on and how empty that is. And then it's difficult also if you've had residual momentum from the day. And sometimes you almost have to feed and dissolve that intention into a broader meditation object, such as the sound of silence or metta. Often if there's sort of the narrative you can't let go of from the day or from work, just bringing one of those broad, spacious meditation objects, like a broad sense of loving kindness, of light, and letting those narratives dissolve in that slowly. It's a way to let that residual momentum of intention fade. And then there's how we, after we've gained insight, and sometimes it's as simple as just anchoring yourself for a time to the breath and seeing those fantasies pass and just getting a little distance from them until they fade. That can be enough. And often a lot of those fantasies, narratives, verbalizations are tied up with internal verbalization. And as the meditation refines, you'll notice that every internal verbalization is associated with a pattern in the body. So if you relax the body, soften the eyes, soften the jaw, relax the tongue, relax the belly, you'll notice the thoughts dissolve of their own accord. Those intentional formations dissolve into a soft, relaxed sense. It's significant that Valium actually has no mental effect. What it does is it's just a muscle relaxant. But that fact means that by relaxing the muscles so effectively, the mind drops into a state of complete calm. This is also the use of cultivating breath meditation and of a body scan, is that you become aware of the little knots of tension you're holding in your body. After we've cleaned house a little bit, after you've seen what you're feeding on, and it can be useful to kind of imagine yourself feeding off, like as a little character feeding off of whatever that looks like. Like, what would it look like if you were in the corner feeding off of that argument, your arms elbow deep into some kind of dark muck? What would that look like? It's not beautiful. And would you want to be seen feeding off of the argument, the anger, the resentment? That helps you let go. And once you've let go and come to some measure of calm, then you can begin to cultivate these alternate sources of nourishment in the meditation. But so often we jump straight to that and forget that moment of pausing and just seeing what we're feeding off of then, which is the first and second noble truth. Where's our craving leading us to seek nourishment and our suffering from that? Let the heart tell you what it is feeling, and then you can begin to direct it. But let it speak first, and just listen. Just take a while to listen. So then when you start training intention, there are different ways of doing it. Practice is a tiered process. You need robust meditation objects sometimes when the mind has a lot of momentum, a lot of intention. And if there's been a really strong argument at work or something, then often you can't just sort of, you can know what's going on, but it's not enough to let it go. You have to give your mind something equally juicy but wholesome to rest in during meditation to counteract it. The breath won't be enough immediately. And this is when you can begin by doing walking meditation, by chanting, by learning a chant. There's some monastics whose practice was to walk meditation for about 10 hours a day, chanting suttas the whole time until their mind became still, and then they just could sit. Because there are two ways of leading the mind to calm. One is to tell yourself to be calm. The other is to make yourself do chin-ups until you collapse exhausted, the most relaxed you'll ever be. So sometimes it's okay to really push yourself until the mind just stops. This is also where mantra practice comes in. It's quite a robust meditation object to repeat a word such as Buddha, peace, awake, love. This is also where the very active visualizing elements of breath meditation come into mind, such as those taught by Ajahn Jeff, Ajahn Suchito, Ajahn Lee, of imagining the breath as a white mist moving in and out of the body, or as a stream of energy flowing through the main meridian down the front of the spine, or front of the body and up the spine, or down the back of the spine, up the front of the body, depending. And you'll notice that after a while, the intention begins to soften, to refine, and you can let go of those more robust meditation objects and switch to a subtler one. And maybe that's the sound of silence, or maybe it's, if you've been cultivating the mindfulness of, say, metta, this is when you can drop the image or the phrase and just rest with the warm glow in the heart. It's a more subtle object. And here it's significant to see how intention is getting more subtle because contact and consciousness are beginning to come back into play more as nourishments, as nutriments. After you've initiated that warm glow of metta, that flame warms the heart of its own accord, and the mind feels less motivated to churn out fantasy after fantasy and to think, because it's being nourished by this warm glow of internal, subtle, wholesome, sensory contact, in a sense, the warm glow of metta. Or say the mind just has a subtle sense of peace, of coolness. We're beginning to find these slow-burning sources of internal nourishment that aren't the external sense bases. They're not fragile. They're yours. Even if you're in a hospital bed, no matter what goes wrong, those are yours. You can always develop loving kindness. You can always come to the breath. And what's difficult, though, is sometimes when these pleasurable things come into being, we lose ourselves in them and begin to just get drunk on the pleasure or the warmth. And that's a mistake, because the foundation of all of these continues to be a subtle intention in meditation. It never stops until nibbana. It just becomes more subtle. And so in the Anapanasati Sutta, every single step has the admonition to train and to breathe in, one trains thus. Breathing out, one trains thus. The breath and an intention to keep the breath in mind are always there in the background as an anchor and a foundation. And you'll notice that when the meditation gets stale, it's because maybe you've stopped applying intention in the right way. So that's when you can bring to mind something more subtle, like metta or something. But it's also significant that in mindfulness of breathing, one thing you train in is becoming sensitive. Patisangvediti. So one becomes sensitive to the breath. One becomes sensitive to rapture, to pleasure, to the mind. And in meditation, this is, in the guided meditation, what we did when you focus down and really try to become interested in how the breath feels, the coolness, that moment before the inhale, before the exhale. How is it manifesting? So intention can be that subtle. It can just be a subtle placing of awareness gently on the object of meditation. And then but sometimes our intention is so coarse and heavy because we're so used to doing in our culture that it just clamps down on the breath. And that's when it's useful to sort of split awareness a bit, either between 2 points, holding the tailbone and the head in mind at the same time as you track the breath, or between the aspect of kindness and the breath. It divides the intention up a little bit and lets it not crush the bird of meditation. So this is how we cultivate that path in sitting, is you suddenly cut yourself off from all these external sources of thirsting and feeding. And it's hard at first, and the mind begins to churn out the same old junk food that it's churned out for its how many decades on earth. And then you begin to steer it gently towards more and more wholesome and subtle ways of using intention, and more subtle fountains of nourishment inside. This is using the nutriments to work on the path. And the one final thing I'll go into is in life. once again, so often it's this paradigm we move through life in with craving and feeding off of those around us. We are a consumerist culture par excellence. And the word for craving, thirst, in Buddhism, that is the source of suffering, is tanha, which means thirst. There's a contrasting word called chanda, which is translated frequently as zeal. And it can also manifest as a sort of zeal or enthusiasm for sensuality that's not healthy. But it can also manifest as an aspect, an enthusiasm to create, to do, intention. So rather than feeding, we move through effort into the practice of Dhamma and give. And instead of moving into the world with an intention to take, we move with an intention to gift. And this takes very concrete forms. Instead of sinking into the same Netflix binge that maybe you usually would, can one instead sit down and write something? Instead of listening to music, can you begin to learn a sutta, a chant, a prayer? Instead of going and seeing a movie, can you go and actually spend the time in conversation that's meaningful with Kali and Amitta, spiritual friendships? Can you give? And can you more and more find the happiness that's sustaining in terms of progressing on this path, instead of taking from the world that can't provide that sort of happiness that we expect from it? And once again, not to say that there's no place for good relationship, for movies, for music, for all these things. There are, but they can't be the ultimate goal of our lives or our ultimate source of happiness. Once we've cultivated and gained skill at finding this in-source source of nourishment, then we can go about our usual life like a man who's won the lottery but keeps on working his job just, to have something to do. And that man will never be stressed about the job. He'll never cheat for the job. He'll never backstab to get ahead, because he's okay. He's got what he needs. But he'll continue to move through life with a good-hearted view and a bit of a smile. And that's our goal, is to be able to hold the world lovingly and lightly. So I wish that for all of you.
Sadhu, 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 anumodhami.
Thanks all. The nourishments, the nutriments are really, it's a difficult one actually. So we have a chance for questions now, or topics people would like to discuss, if anyone has something they'd like to bring up. So the question is, in terms of limiting music or other kind of sensual desires, how has it benefited me? First, music isn't that bad. The issue is when it, that experience where you sit in meditation, there's a song stuck in your head? Yeah. So if you're cultivating really refined states, the mind gets very sensitive. And, someone who's attained deep concentration can move through anything with being untouched. That's the definition of enlightenment, is you touch an immutable quality, whether it's being imprisoned by the Chinese or whatever. But most of us can't hear the most recent Katy Perry song without it dominating our meditation for a week. At least, I remember I went to Fauntleroy Church to attend a service recently because they're hosting our retreats for us. And one person played Over the Rainbow on a ukulele, and for a week, that was literally my meditation. So but there's an important, this is the issue, is people can take it so wrong, and they can tie themselves up into knots around renouncing this and that. And there's a place for pushing yourself, but it's important to see that these things aren't necessarily bad, and they're not wrong necessarily. It's that we have to acknowledge our minds are kind of these gaping wounds. And if you really are diving deep, it's like you're clearing off that crust, all the crust that's kind of kept it shielded, because it won't heal as long as there's that crust. But it means it's raw and easily infected. And so that's why it's okay. Like, someone is recently asking, like, I feel like I'm just interested in meditating, but I feel guilty because I'm not participating in all these, climate change movements and activism, and how guilty should I feel? And I think it's just worth recollecting, like, we're far sicker than we think. And it's okay to take a few years to just draw back a little bit, And you have to navigate that boundary, but what you cultivate if you gain that immutability or immutable kind of solidity of heart is an enormous gift. It's worth everything. So, yeah.
We'll follow up with music. One of the monks' precepts to not listen to music, right?
Yeah. The question is, one of the monks' precepts is to not listen to music. And yes.
Okay. Yeah, just curious about all that.
Yeah, the Buddha, Ajahn Pasna said, look, the Buddha was kind of diabolical, but his great kindness was in his diabolicalness as well, in the sense that he just cut off everything but the path. There was no compromises. So yeah, like the monastics, we can't watch movies, we can't, listen to music. We're even supposed to avoid talking about, idle chatter. But not everyone has to do that right off the bat. And it's just, if you're going deep in meditation, it's helpful to keep things clean.
Question from Hawk Jones. What is the significance of the Guanine statue next to you?
The question is, what is the significance of the Guanine statue next to me? So, Guanine is in some cultures it's considered a traditional manifestation of Avalokiteshvara, which is the bodhisattva thought of as the bodhisattva of infinite compassion, a being that is supposed to remain until all beings are liberated. And Guanine is the feminine manifestation. She isn't, and neither is Avalokiteshvara, found in the Pali texts. However, I think it can be a helpful acknowledgement of the feminine within our culture and imagery. In that, I think it's meaningful to have up here. Just as that recollection of those qualities as well. We had one question that came up, someone emailed, was last Wednesday we spoke about someone asked about the first precept of not killing, and the email asked if there's ever a justifiable reason to, say, put a pet out of its misery. And specifically saying, look, there's like a few instances in the suttas where enlightened beings take their own lives. And what if a pet is asking for us to do that, And the answer to that is in a Buddhist conception, regardless of motivation, the intention to kill is always unskillful. So even if the motivation is to put something out of its misery, if the intention is to take that life, then it leaves a scar on the heart. And I know this strikes close to home for a lot of people. I know when I was a kid, we put my dog down, and he didn't want it. We thought he was ready, and he struggled like crazy. It was one of the more scarring experiences of my life. And I think that's significant is often we don't like to see the animals in pain more than they don't want to be in pain. And sometimes they aren't ready to give away life. And sometimes the use of pain and sickness is that it gets us ready to let go into death. And often, animals will just stop eating when they're ready to die. That being said, and in a Buddhist conception of samsara, of all the wanderings a being can go through, to have the chance to be kind of cared for and loved by a loving human family for a year, it's unbelievably rare. And you don't know what that's going to do to their heart in a good way. Like, that's not a bad investment of a year for a being. That being said, some people will put their animals down. Some people will call the exterminator. And, all our job is to say is that if one decides to take on that karma, that it's the Buddhist job to acknowledge that there is karma there, even if we don't quite understand it. So that's just an important thing, and to not take any decision like that lightly.
Seems like discernment around that is
The question was, to extend that question, what about the artificial extension of a pet's life? And it seems like that's a bit of a gray area. Yeah, there's no obligation to extend a life beyond natural means. There's some great books like Stairway to Heaven, I think, which really warn against, like, the decision to get a pacemaker is not something to be taken lightly, as an adult. And Ajahn Jayasaro was talking to a lot of Thai villagers recently and just saying, like, look, I know you look at these Westerners and are so, it seems like a great life. And in a lot of ways, it is good to be rich. These were kind of poor Thai people in the village. But he said, one advantage you have is that you don't die in an expensive ICU. They die at home. And that's not always beautiful, but yeah, we're under no obligation to extend a life beyond what's natural means. And I know that one touches to the quick for a lot of people, and I'm cautious about saying it, but it is the Buddhist point of view. Is there something mysterious we don't understand there? Should we end on a lighter note? Anyone? One more question?
Question, but it's not light.
That's okay.
In the context of activism, I was wondering how one works with this intention to let go of the sense of self when one lives in a society or inhabits bodies which are constantly being made to experience violence.
So the question was, in terms of letting go, in terms of thinking about activism, in terms of letting go of the sense of self, how does one do that when forced to live in a society where the body is and the person is constantly the recipient of some levels of violence?
Because of one's race or gender.
Because of one's race or gender. Well, first, I'm probably the least best equipped person to talk about that one. So, being a white, privileged male. And I'd say, I think there's been a beautiful movement in society to acknowledge those differences recently. Me Too, Black Lives Matter, all these things. I mean, and that was a long time coming. The orientation of the Buddhist worldview is that the transcendent, the human, and nibbana are always paramount. And secondarily, we interact with and consider those differences as well. So that is to say that I think if someone really was experiencing those things, like that's going to be a big part of someone's probably life, and they might feel drawn to engage with society in quite active ways around it, and that's not wrong at all. And constantly in the background, the teaching remains the same of still looking at this body as 5 aggregates passing away and rising. And the thing is, from a Buddhist perspective, people born in the wrong body in terms of gender, or people who are attracted to the same sex, etc. It makes complete sense in the Buddhist worldview. We're just being reborn into different sets of clothes again and again, and you get, who knows what you're going to get stuck with here and there. But the ground and the purpose is always nirvana. And the Buddha pushed back hard in that way around, the caste system was so reified in Indian society, and he was constantly acknowledging its presence, and he'd speak to different people in their vernacular, but he'd, in the end, what he'd always come back to at the very end of the day was their potential for awakening. And I acknowledge it's a difficult line between whitewashing it, so to speak, and just being, spiritual bypass, it's just convention, which it's not. I mean, it is, but there's something to be worked with there. But yeah, it always comes back to that, the khandhas. Thank you.